Andy, please, unless I'm in trouble. A modern state needs a massive infrastructure to carry out its functions, to provide essential services for business and other organisations, and to support households and individual citizens. Roads, railways, ports, airports, dams, utilities, parks, hospitals and schools need to be developed and supported. The list is nearly endless. Underpinning and adjacent to these physical infrastructure examples are the modern state's location-based information assets. A spatial data infrastructure extends beyond data storage systems and is a wider information asset management framework that facilitates maintaining and maximising value. Users rely heavily on the same trusted information to make decisions that affect people's safety, prosperity and the environment. And the state plays a key role as an enabler of innovation through discovery and access to reliable, trusted data from custodians. Across Australia and New Zealand, ANZLIC is a peak intergovernmental organisation responsible for providing leadership of the region's SDI. Under the Foundation Spatial Data Framework, 10 themes of spatial data have been described that as lead agency, the Department of Natural Resources and Mines has state jurisdictional responsibility for. Spatial data across these themes cover an entire extent of land and coastal waters of the state, from the property to the regional scale. This is no small task. Under the FSDF, imagery is described as the output derived from the use of sensor technologies to detect, locate, classify and record objects relative to the surface of the Earth. This includes data sourced from satellite, airborne and terrestrial sensors and cameras having a range of capabilities. It includes optical, laser and radar sensor data measured across several regions of the electromagnetic spectrum. Imagery expands your perspective, seeing in the visible 2D and 3D, the past 4D, the invisible 5D and into the future. Imagery has been an industry both present in and disrupted across all industrial ages. The first aerial photographs were captured in 1858 over a French village from a balloon. Operationalised during the First World War, the state's imagery story begins in the machine age at the junction of aircraft technology, photography and a need for intelligence. Sound familiar? The first known aerial photography captured in Queensland was over the Gold Coast hinterland by the RAAF. During the late 1920s, they took delivery of 30 gypsy moths from a British manufacturing firm. The department holds some copies of aerial prints from this project, with the original film held by National Archives. The landscape changes across this region since, with new canal estates, transport and coastal infrastructure, make for a stunning time series to present day. Over the next 19 years, aerial photography capture programs are undertaken ad hoc by a mixture of the RAAF, state agencies and private survey companies. The first coordinated state aerial photography program was let to Adastra Airways in 1949, capturing 8 areas along the eastern Australian coastal regions. The watershed moment of the state's imagery history was undoubtedly 1952 with the introduction of the Survey Coordination Act. This legislative move classified aerial photography as a survey and required it to be lodged with the Surveyor General and the Central Plan Office. This collection was titled the State Aerial Photography Library, and under the Surveyor General thus began the role that DNRM and its predecessor agencies have long held in undertaking operational management of the State Coordinated Program for Reference Spatial Imagery, and in addition have either managed or influenced the acquisition of project imagery captures for other departments and authorities. The state program continued and was supplemented by a Commonwealth program from 1954 to 1980 in regional Queensland, shown by the green areas here. Following the space launch of the US government's Landsat mission in 1972, the department began its Landsat data acquisition program in 1986. In 2003, the Surveying and Mapping Infrastructure Act was updated to include imagery from non-aerial platforms and a responsibility for the ongoing data acquisition and maintenance of the collection. This current Act defines the department's legislative responsibility to keep and maintain the Library of Land and Coastal Waters on behalf of the state interest. 2005 saw the state's first LiDAR capture and the start of the historical aerial film scanning project. By the start of 2008, the industry led our change from film to digital capture, sparking a significant operational change from in-house aerial film handling and photographic development lab work to GIS and remote sensing computational tasks. At that time, the library contained over 1 million image frames. After a funding hiatus, 2008 marked the start of the Spatial Imagery Acquisition Plan and Subscription Program funding model under the oversight of the Queensland Spatial Information Council, and that continues to this day. High-resolution digital orthophotography capture was supplemented in 2012 and 2014 with the SPOT satellite imagery. And 2015 has seen the launch and inclusion of European Space Agency's Sentinel satellite data, which is providing 10-metre resolution over the far reaches of coastal waters for the first time. And more recently, the department's conducted a trial of imagery data from the San Francisco startup company Planet. Their constellation of microsatellites, termed doves, are each about the size of a loaf of bread and act as a line scanner for the planet. When fully launched, they are aiming to acquire imagery to 3-metre resolution over every landmass on the planet on a daily basis. But most relevantly, 2015 masked the first capture and inclusion of an RPAS project imagery in the library and the Queensland Globe over the much publicised Rain Island turtle nesting site. After 86 years of imagery activities, the library comprises 5 analogue and digital archives comprising in excess of 1 million images and half a petabyte of data and growing. In its own right, the library has proven to be a valuable asset for the state, providing records of the changes that have occurred on the land over time, as well as the records of particular activities that took place on the land. But an effective spatial data infrastructure requires more than just data storage and curation. It is a combination of the library with enabling frameworks, standards and policies, activities and user systems that maintain and maximise the value of the imagery infrastructure to the current day. But governments and government systems have always been disrupted by changing economic, social and environmental influences. Witnessing for several years the growth and maturity of the RPAS industry, there has also been a growing recognition of the unique value proposition that the RPAS platform offers for spatial imagery acquisition. These include capture under cloud, because for all of the orbiting satellites, cloud is still an issue, and for much manned photography as well. Imagery resolution and data density capture by RPAS sensors is unmatched by manned aircraft and satellite platforms, perhaps with the exception of helicopters. The distribution of aircraft operators and mobilisation options are on a trajectory to surpass manned operations capacity if they haven't already. And frequency of capture and revisit for a given location because of that nature of distribution. And finally, access of the imagery data to more users and for more uses than we've ever seen before. However, for those wishing to utilise the platform, there are considerations across the continuum of legal obligations to the data management lifecycle that must be addressed. Privacy law in Australia is a patchwork of common law and statute at both Commonwealth and state and territory levels. There have been recommendations for a federal legislative response made by a parliamentary committee and 2 law reform commissions that, if ever enacted, would have application to privacy facilitated by sensors mounted on remotely piloted aircraft. In their absence, the right to sue for trespass to land is not limited to interference on the land surface of the land alone, but extends to infractions of the airspace above the land, limited to the height of reasonable usage. Private nuisance is also an avenue for those with the requisite interest in the land. There are also circumstances where sensors mounted on remotely piloted aircraft have the capacity to capture private activities. The paper by Des Butler here provides a fascinating read. I'm not qualified to provide comment on legal matters, and you should seek your own legal advice. Legally, it has been held that a photograph or video of an individual constitutes personal information about that individual. Under the Commonwealth Privacy Act 1988, the Australian privacy principles apply equally to Commonwealth government agencies and private organisations. But you'll see here that the state remains absent. We're picked up by the Information Privacy Act, which is state legislation, and the privacy principles from that Act apply to all Queensland government agencies and contracted service providers. A government agency or private organisation which operates an RPA on which a sensor is mounted and which captures images of individuals are obliged to comply with the relevant personal information regime in relation to the collection, use and disclosure of those images. For Queensland government agencies, the authoritative source on this topic is the Office of the Information Commissioner in Queensland. The more data is opened, the more it can be used, reused, repurposed and built on in combination with other data for everyone's benefit. Queensland Government agencies are encouraged to negotiate contracts to maximise the state interest regarding IP ownership developed by contractors on behalf of the Queensland Government. Government procurement objectives advocate for a flexible approach that considers a broader public value than the immediate task. Copyright ownership is a critical enabler for establishing open licensing. And from the state remotely sensed image library's perspective, all copyright eventually expires, one day allowing imagery access in the public domain. When one starts thinking of imagery data as an information asset and with value beyond the immediate need, the idea of managing data through a life cycle becomes more relevant. Standards make it easier to create, share and integrate data by making sure that there is a clear understanding of how the data are represented and that the data that you receive are in a form that you expected. Planning for incorporation of these at the procurement stage is critical. Protocols and methods must be employed to ensure the data are properly collected, handled, processed, used and maintained at all stages of the data lifecycle. And this begins through contract performance management. Updated and complete metadata are critical to maintaining data quality. A standard format allows easier comparison and electronic transfer to catalogue systems. Queensland Government agencies must implement specific information security controls to protect information assets, particularly those containing personal information. The authoritative source on this topic is the Queensland Government Chief Information Office. As a government agency, from the time you decide to collect or use data in business, under legislation, that information becomes a public record and needs to be accounted for and managed. An appropriate data custodian must be identified and understand their obligations. Imagery data to be used as legal evidence must maintain a chain of custody to ensure integrity. For imagery included under the State Remotely Sensed Imagery Library, Section 131 of the Infrastructure Act actually authorises the Department to supply a court certificate as evidence for legal proceedings. And this isn't just for government agencies, this is for the general public as well too. DNRM currently runs a procurement preferred supplier panel arrangement for manned aerial photography and LiDAR capture and is progressing towards a similar arrangement for RPAS in the belief that demand has reached a critical mass sufficient to warrant the significant financial and resource investment towards a panel approach. The Department's interest on behalf of the state is fourfold. Firstly, to ensure that any spatial imagery data that is captured by Queensland Government agencies is of maximum quality and utility to enable inclusion in the library and enable future use. Secondly, to reduce duplication of procurement effort across Queensland Government agencies and expenditure on multiple imagery acquisitions of a similar nature. Thirdly, to ensure that the commercial operators providing their services to Queensland Government agencies are undertaking best practice operations that mitigate potential risks to the Queensland Government and greater public. And finally, to work hand in hand with the business community to grow the RPAS industry through sustainable economic practices. The Q imagery application flat battery, there we go. Q imagery application is being released in late 2016 and that will provide the first publicly available discovery and access of the contents of the State Remotely Sensed Image Library. The initial release will include 800,000 historical aerial photos from 1930 to 2006, available under open licensing, with subsequent releases of imagery from other platforms and more recent epochs in the releases following. Around this time, the Queensland Globe version 2 is also due for release as a browser-based and web services-driven open data tool for visualising over 600 state datasets. So on a final note, for over 80 years, together the spatial imagery industry and the state government have been building a spatial data infrastructure, the envy of the nation. The forces of big data afforded by RPAS and other imagery sensor platforms pose a significant challenge to the next phase of the Queensland spatial imagery infrastructure. The library, as we understand it, must evolve to remain relevant. Aggregated content in a networked industrial age. For as data begins to age, its value does not diminish, but the nature of that value does begin to change. Data is no longer purely static. It lives on a continuum where different actions are taken on it and value can be derived from it in different ways. Working together, we have the opportunity to amass significant ongoing value of RPAS imagery data. and a shared responsibility to do so for future generations. And this is the defining moment. Thank you.